Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest of our series of Bootham Talks, our penultimate one for this academic year. And it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome a great friend of Bootham School, a gentleman who has got a child here, has had two here at one particular point, and has been very, very supportive of the school and its values and the work that it's been doing at times and looking into the future over the last few years. So a great welcome this evening to Norman Pickavance, who I hope will appear on the screen very shortly. Here he's coming. Norman, it's good to see you. It's good to welcome you to talk to us this evening. Thank you for contacting us and saying that you'd like to do a talk, I think. And we are delighted to give you the opportunity to do so, because we know that the things that you are concerned about are the things that, as a Quaker school, we are also concerned about. For those of you who don't know Norman, among other things in his career, was the HR and Communications Director of Morrison's between 2007 and 2012. So if you've got some backdated complaints, you probably know where to go with that. He's also much more known these days as an advisor, as an author, and an activist, working particularly in the field of how business and society interlink and how business can improve society. He has a particular desire to explore fairness and equality and levelling up, which of course is one of the great things on the agenda today. And I know that his ongoing connection with Quaker values and with Quakerism is a significant part of how that is developing for him. So Norman, it's great to welcome you this evening. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And we're really looking forward to hearing you talk about Generation COVID.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and welcome to everybody this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity to talk about something I am really interested in. If I just spend a few moments building on Chris's introduction, my background is 25 years in corporate life before really spending most of the last decade working on more strategic and policy issues with political parties, with heads of business, and as Chris says, trying to bring together the various strands so that we get some more cohesive policy making and some more far-sighted thinking on some of the big issues that we face. I don't think there's any more of a big issue than the challenges faced by the next generation. This is something which my organization, the Financial Inclusion Alliance, has taken a particular interest in. Now I'm going to hope that the technology works. Yes, it does. To give you an idea of our work, last year, and over the last few years, have been looking at issues of economic and social inclusion. And last year ran a conference at the Guildhall in London for over 200 leaders, which really looked at the issues facing Britain's working poor. The challenge there obviously is, being in work used to be the best route out of poverty. And we found through our work that actually for over 4 million people in Britain today, that is no longer the case. And we were putting a challenge to business leaders to think through what their part in addressing those issues could be. But we've moved on from that, because one of the issues that we identified in that review was that there were three groups that were struggling particularly as a result of these inequalities. And they were women, people from Black and ethnic minorities, and young people. And we decided that we would pay particular attention to the issues surrounding young people, because at that point, no one else was paying particular attention to that subject. So that's really what we're going to talk about this evening. When people in other areas talk about intergenerational fairness, they ask audiences to think about this question: how old will you be in 2050? So if we do have any students on the call, parents, and your ancient parents may well be as old as your grandparents. And whilst that usually poses a degree of reflection. Unfortunately, it hasn't led to much by the way of action at this stage. So what I wanted to try to do this evening was to explore in two different ways this topic of the fairness between generations and how we needed to think differently about policy, about economics, about work, and indeed about education, if we are to address some of the imbalances which I believe are only going to become more acute. So to set the scene, and I realized that after a long day at 7 o'clock in the evening, thinking a little bit philosophically about things perhaps isn't what you were hoping for this evening. But I thought I'd start with 3 philosophical questions about as we think about the relationship between generations. The first one is the notion that different generations embody different qualities. So easier if we look back a generation. So this slide is a kind of sense of what the Second World War generation perhaps represents in our minds. A generation of sacrifice, both in terms of the wartime effort itself, but also going without things. Obviously a picture there of rationing. A sense of service, of something, serving something greater than self, and a sense of solidarity that we actually needed to pull together if we were going to get through the most difficult times. And it's interesting to think then about the things that we took from that generation. So I know that I think I recall correctly that Chris is a big Bob Dylan fan, and as the generation that was ushered in the 1960s, they took the benefits of all of those things, the sacrifices, the solidarity, and the service that had been given, and benefited from the stability and growth that followed on from that. They also talked about the downside, the dark side of what that generation gave to them. So the over rigidity, the over deference, perhaps, the not willing to take risks, or to, because of the solidarity, a lack of individual expression. I think the question which I'd like to pose to people on this call is, what is it that we are passing on to the next generation? It's very, actually, when these comments come up, it can be quite distracting. So I apologize for the slight pause there. So there's a theme that's going to run through this discussion, which is about intergenerational relationships. The second theme that's going to run through this discussion, I hope, is the notion, or our understanding of progress. So we think of being stood on the shoulders of giants, that we owe, if you like, a debt to the scientific and technological enterprise and the wisdom of previous generations and what they've given to us. And so, we think about the Einsteins of this world, and the people who discovered DNA, and how that has helped this generation to build on those discoveries and take humanity to the next stage of its evolution. But progress isn't always an inevitability, and it doesn't necessarily run in a straight line. So in this example, I wanted to talk about it's a great agriculturalist from the United States, who, at the time of the end of the war and into the 1950s, the biggest fear that the world had at that point in time was one of world hunger, that it would be unable to feed itself. There were, all the way through until the 1970s, great famines, like the one in 1971 in Bangladesh, and many others. And so the world scientists and agriculturalists were charged by governments with coming up with methods that would help us to feed the world, literally. And they did that. They invented modern intensive farming as we know it today, with its high use of pesticides, its use of modified crops, its use of intense fertilizer, and it managed to double and triple world grain production. The food industry, as we know it today, grew up out of that with mass-produced food in supermarkets, and were able to ensure that ordinary families, not just in this country but around the world, were able to buy products that would have previously been, at times a luxury, and certainly not an everyday item. But we now know that there was a price to that apparent progress, and that price we witness at the kind of highest level in terms of soil degradation, the impacts of climate, and of mass migration from areas which no longer produces enough food to support the people who live there. And so progress isn't a straight line, it's a more complex thing. And things that we may have thought were moving us forward, we are now left in picking up the pieces and having to solve ourselves. So again, one of the other things I'd like, if possible, you to hold at the back of your mind as we talk about some of the more specifics today, is this sense of is it, or do we want to set a different course, and how does that shape our relationships with the next generation? Provide as a sort of overarching piece of introduction to what we're going to talk about is the notion of intergenerational justice. This chap is very famous in legal circles, and liberal thinking circles. His theory of justice touched on many things, but he did talk about intergenerational relationships. And I just wanted to read this out as it relates to from that 1971 book on what is saved and given. And so he said, the rate at which every generation should obtain from consumption in order to invest wealth in ways that bring good results for future generations is what really describes just savings. So it's not just about what we save for ourselves, but our ability to bring good results for future generations. So and as we go through the rest of the talk this evening, I'd like you to think about that, about whether the justice between generations, about what we mean by progress, and what it is that we as a generation will be known for in generations to come. Okay, so I hope that's enough food for thought at 7 o'clock. So I've called this generation COVID, and that's really for two reasons. First of all, many of the trends that we will talk about this evening are things that were already happening. So it's not just as a result of COVID, but it's the way in which the pandemic has both accentuated issues and accelerated the speed at which the future is arriving, and the degree to which that is bringing into sharper focus what all this might mean for young people. So the pandemic, not as not in itself as a thing, although obviously it is having a big effect in some areas, but the way in which it's acted as an accelerator of trends that were already happening. So let's explore that in a bit more detail. In our research, this is the work of the Financial Inclusion Alliance. And I should say that is it's a not-for-profit research and innovation body. So that's what we do. We work with large businesses and governments on some of these things. But we've identified 4 overarching themes that are impacting the next generation. They are Things that come under the banner of living predictable. Things to do with the prospects that young people might have expected to have, and the way in which those prospects are changing. Things to do with prosperity and whether that's been added to or undermined. And as I've touched on already, things to do with our whole notion of what progress means. So those are the four areas we're going to touch on, and those areas actually intersect. And in coming together, they start to shape the future well-being of the next generation, and also the way in which they're looking at things. And this might perhaps start to explain some of the differences in outlook that exists inevitably one generation to the next, but I think particularly between our generation and the generations that are following. So let's take each area at a time. So starting off with precarious lives. We're all aware of the way education has been terribly disrupted over the last year. And from time to time, we hear the headlines of the number of young people who've been furloughed and who are being made unemployed. What perhaps is less commonly known is that of those unemployed, 74% of young people have been unemployed for more than 6 months. And that there are, on top of that, still a further 800,000 young people who are still in furlough. And whilst we're all hopeful that the economy is going to bounce back immediately, there are serious concerns from bodies such as the Resolution Foundation and indeed the Prince's Trust that when those two things come together, it will send a spike in unemployment that we haven't seen since the early 1980s. Now that's set against the backdrop of what's also happening in the world of technology. Some of the things that we've been talked about in terms of the future of work and so on, to talk about this in a bit more detail in the next slide. But what's surprising is there are today a very high number of jobs which are going unfilled. And that's because employers feel that 50%, over 50% of the applications that they receive from young people don't have the qualifications or the experience that they're looking for. So despite the fact that we, spend a great deal of time ensuring that children get the best possible education, and we are seeing students now who spend more time in education than ever before, half of all employers don't think that they're coming through to them with the skills that they got, and that's clearly a big part of the challenge. But it's also some of the non-cognitive skills that employers are now looking for, because technology is picking up so much of the slack. So when you add that to the rise in gig working and what's euphemistically now known, I believe, amongst young people as side hustles, which in old money means doing more than one job at a time, you start to see that what used to be a steady path out of education into employment and then a career is at risk of serious disruption. There are other dimensions to this precariety, though, which are going on at the same time. You've all heard the phrase generation rent. 2/3 of all young people in the under 30 group are now in rented accommodation. A quarter are still in rented accommodation by the time they hit 40. We are, because of the lack of house building, producing a generation that is totally reliant on rented accommodation. And because of the way that the housing market is structured in the UK, those rents can be colossally high. And I'll come back to what that means. But what we have, therefore, is a because of the nature of the laws related to renting in the UK, we have a very large number of people who have very little by the way of security around where they live, because of the notice periods that being in rented accommodation can give the landlord in the UK. You can be very quickly turfed out, and that creates a sense of insecurity that perhaps most people on this call have never known. Finally, obviously, there's the climate crisis, and as we were completing our research, there were two facts that stood out for me. One was in Europe, this is a research by the European Central Bank, across Europe, 41% of young people believe that sometime in the next 20 years, they're going to have to leave the country of birth and go and live somewhere else because of the ravages of climate change, whether that's rising water levels or increased temperatures, inability to grow crops. They believe that they're going to have to move not just from their address, but from the country in which they live. 41%. I found that to be a staggering number. The other number I found to be absolutely staggering was the number of young people who are contemplating not having families because they worry about either the impact that climate would have on their children, or that they would contribute to the climate crisis by having children themselves. That's 25% of young people have that level of worry. So there's a level of eco-anxiety that I, until we started to dig into this, I had never really fully appreciated. So you put all of those factors together, unemployment, the way technology is changing, lack of secure accommodation, and climate. And this quote from the Times, Financial Times, seems to sum it up, that young people feel they're drowning in security. And that insecurity, they can't see how they're going to get out of this way of feeling. And we'll come back to the long-term impact of that in a few moments. So, precarious lives. The second area is uncertain prospects. So I talked about education already. When I was going through education, which is an awful long time ago now, it used to be really clear. You would go to school, get good grades, go on to university, get a degree, get a job, and build a career. And as a result of that, your prospects for the future would be pretty secure. And every parent on this call, the biggest aspiration that they have is their children have as many prospects for the future as they can have. I think what is emerging from the changes in technology, and everybody's familiar with the gig economy and think of things like Deliveroo and Just Eat and so on. But it is starting with the spread of artificial intelligence to impact the kinds of professions that, certainly when I was growing up, parents would aspire for their children to go into, whether that's the law or accounting. And that those professions themselves are being hollowed out and will increasingly be hollowed out by artificial intelligence, which is far better at data processing and number crunching than people could ever be. And so some of those kind of myriad jobs that exist in big accounting and legal practices are disappearing. And that will be the same in banking and many other areas where that's how people would have earned their early experience, and which they can build on to develop a career. Work organizations are therefore changing radically. We have heard about the future of work and the way in which organizations are being de-layered. These layers are also the career ladders that young people would aspire to climb, to work hard, and then in their 30s and 40s start to earn decent amounts of money. Those career routes, those straightforward pathways, are fast becoming very confused. And so the straightforward hopes of what a career might look like are changing quite radically. So the notion of things that perhaps some of the more mature members on this call have thought about in terms of portfolio careers are starting to affect young people much earlier in lives. So our aspirations for standard careers may well be something very soon of the past. Clearly, that's affecting salary progression, and particularly if you come from a more disadvantaged background, the notion that you might be able to, through your career, move up the social layers in society has, as we know, already stalled. And there's kind of much more of a case of social immobility. Obviously, all of this is having a huge detrimental impact long term on the earnings and employment in the economy. And it's the Prince's Trust that has identified that might cost somewhere in the region of 14 billion over the next 7 years. So big changes. The next area I wanted to touch on is prosperity. So clearly, an unstable work environment where the kind of standard career paths are no longer present is going to have an effect on long-term prosperity of young people today. So I just wanted to give a couple of insights into how that is playing through. So first of all, disposable income. A study by Yorkshire Building Society has identified that rental costs alone in certain areas of the country now amount to between 60 and 70% of income. 60 and 70% of income. Consequently, people's ability to save is being minimized. Over 50% of young people have no savings whatsoever, which is okay if the bank and mum and dad is there to support people when they go through difficult times. But when that isn't there, and you're in perhaps less stable employment, your ability to get access to more traditional loans and finance becomes very difficult. And we're aware of the credit and debt spirals that people can get into. As a result of all this, 3/4 of all young people today have serious worries about finance. But there's a long-term issue. It's not just the short-term consequences of the difficult economic phase that we're going through right now. The longer-term issues are as follows. If you've been unable to save, then the chances of you being able to save up enough to put down a deposit for a home becomes a much longer shot. And as I've mentioned already, today over 25% of young people are getting to the age of 40 without having had the chance to even contemplate buying their own home. And this situation we anticipate only getting more challenging. The same logic on lack of savings applies for pensions, and not saving adequately for pensions for the future. And so we saw last week a report from the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, that young people are now more likely to see their future wealth being dictated by what their parents' wealth was than by anything that they earn in their own lifetimes. Now it's a profound statement, because it goes to the very heart of our thought process that we live in a meritocracy, that through our own efforts we can aspire to reach the very top, and that we can succeed in terms of wealth and whatever to get to the highest rungs in society. If that is no longer the case, which hasn't been the case in the UK for perhaps over 100 years, then the kind of pointers are far more Dickensian than any of us would like to imagine. And net, that all has an impact on young people's independence. 50 years ago, people would be completely financially independent of their parents by the time they were 22. Today, that figure is now looking like late 20s, and we anticipate by 2030 that it will be before people get into their 30s before they may be able to stand completely on their own 2 feet from a financial perspective. That clearly starts to impact how people feel about society and what they think is going on, which takes me on to my final, we mean by progress, which, as you know, was one of the first questions I was asking at the beginning of this. What we're witnessing is the beginning of what I would call embedded inequality. So if your parents, were fortunate enough to perhaps have got in on the property ladder in London 30 years ago before things really took off, then you may be looking forward to a sizable inheritance. But if you weren't quite as lucky as that, and you grew up perhaps on a social housing estate in York, then your wealth and likely future wealth is going to be the same as your parents. And this is starting to question whether you can do much about that. From what we've talked about also, with climate and so on, you can start to see the prospect of a much more burdened generation. And this is reducing trust between generations. Quotes in a survey that the Financial Times completed, questioning whether this generation can really trust the generation, us, enough to make the right decisions for them. So the potential for growing resentments and a strain on the social contract is quite considerable. So these are some of the themes which kind of go beyond the immediate, but the way I would describe it, and you recall, that these are four themes which are intersecting, is that they're having knock-on effects on each other and affecting each of these four domains, are washing back on each other and working in very strange ways that we don't yet understand. I think going back to where I started with thinking about what do we mean by progress and intergenerational justice. What is it that we are hoping to leave for the next generation? When we think about what it was that we inherited, whether that be free education or large graduate schemes and career ladders, or the chance of buying a house, a peaceful planet, the ability to save up for a happy retirement, the chance to move up beyond where your parents were, and financial security, that many of those notions of what progress might have been about, I would say, are now being questioned. I suppose the bigger question is, so what do we do about that? What do we, as members of, I would describe as the lucky generation, who benefited, who took the benefit of the peace dividend, and were able to increase their personal prosperity greater than any generation before? What is it that we hope to pass on to the next? And what are the policy changes, if we are concerned, or the practical changes that we can engage in that might give something back to the next generation as they try to figure out what a new pathway might look like, as they try to navigate a way through an uncertain future. And I will pause there and hope that I've waffled on enough, Chris, to stimulate some interesting questions from the group who've dialed in on this, what has been a wet and windy day, to hear me talk about further gloom and doom. I have to say, just to finish off, that young people never cease to amaze me with their creativity, ingenuity, and desire to put things right. And in various surveys I've read, despite all these injustices, young people are as committed as any generation before them to want to fix the problems that they see in the world around them. So I have faith in the next generation. Oh, there was one final thing, Christopher. Sorry for. I started off with a myth about we stand on the shoulders of giants to achieve what we've achieved. Giants in science and technology, and people who've made great sacrifices. That story comes from an original myth about one of the Greek titans, a giant called Orion. And actually, the original myth, many of you will be aware of, that Orion committed a heinous sin. Orion committed a heinous sin, and for that he was blinded. And so he was stumbling around, and one of the gods took pity on him and allowed him to pick up a youth and put the youth on his shoulders. And it was the youth who was able to guide the blind giant towards its redemption, where it was able to find, rediscover its sight, and to see the future. And I think there's something in, like many Greek myths, that notion that to see the future clearly, we are ultimately reliant on the next generation to help us to see beyond the sins that we have been responsible for. Right. On that thought, I will hand now back to Chris, and hope that was worth pausing a minute for. Chris.
It certainly was. Thank you very much. Just for those people who are participating, if you've got a question for Norman or there's a comment you'd like to make, if you type that into the comments on the platform you're watching it on, which is probably Facebook, then we can see those in our little sort of studio here, and we'll see how we go. So a question for Norman I've got here is, have you looked at any international comparisons? Are any countries actually addressing this already?
We're in the early stages of a big research program, and we're hoping that actually some of your comments this evening will feed into that research. But examples of where they're thinking differently already about this would be, for example, in housing. We talked about the housing challenges that we face in the UK being a big contributing factor. In Austria, they do two things. They've got far greater amount of social housing and community housing building, and they have a cap on rents. And so, between the two, having a flat in Vienna is a far easier prospect, and it means that actually there are very few class boundaries. So you don't get the ghettoization of society with nice areas and not nice areas. It's all pretty much of a muchness, and people can live in cheap, side by side, and build stronger communities. So I think you're right. I think there are great examples, and our intention to look more into that over the course of the next 6 months.
One of the things I was sort of interested to note about the elections we had in this country last week was the number of candidates who were standing for parties which believed in universal basic income. I wonder whether you consider that to be a policy that, if you like, your generation and my generation should be throwing our weight behind for the one coming after us.
It's a huge and important question, and I know that it has been very popular, particularly with some of the younger thinkers coming through. I'm not convinced by universal basic income. I have all kinds of fears about it. I suppose that the number one thing is I actually believe that there's a certain amount of dignity that comes through work, and the question that we should be asking ourselves is perhaps a slightly different question, which is, what is the useful work that we need to do now, and how do we ensure that people get paid and properly remunerated for doing that work? Work is a really important element in people feeling that they are part of society and making a contribution to it. And it's one of the most direct ways in which that is possible. And I know from colleagues in Finland, where they have done experiments with UBI, that it was in that sort of sense of being connected to wider society, UBI. So I'm not yet convinced if that's, but I do understand why in a post-industrial world, as I'm constantly told that we live in, that people would see that as a potential forward, and I do understand that. But I think we need to examine why it's difficult for us to imagine what kind of work we could all be contributing to. And it seems to me that there's a huge number of jobs that we could be doing to improve the quality of life around us.
I mean, aside from the points you make there about the importance of work, Mike Shaw, in a question that we've got here, also brings up the issue of universal basic income, but talks about like ideas as well to enable young people to fund their extra years of life. I mean, they're going to need more help than simply working, as you've made quite clear, I think, in what you've said up to now. Are there any ideas and schemes that you are aware of, or any concepts that you're aware of that might help out in that particular regard, as Mike's question indicates here?
Yes, actually one came up. We ran a session like this earlier today, which had a group of over 40 industrialists and business people on the call. And one of the suggestions, which we will be building on, came through from a big media company. And his suggestion was, we have a focus today as a society on taxing income. But what about taxing capital? And you'll be aware, that this sort of concentration of capital wealth was popularized in the Thomas Piketty work. So the idea of thinking about taxation so that, for those people who aren't earning a lot in the early part of their lives, that those who have earned a great deal can start to provide more active help for people in starting careers. Then that redistribution is something we are going to have to examine. And the challenge that we face is it's a difficult one for us as an older generation to face into, because after all, we've worked very hard for what we've got, haven't we? And the notion that we're going to give up some of the comforts that we believe that we've earned for a generation that hasn't had to go through what we've been through is a difficult one for society to engage with. And that's why these questions haven't been addressed. These are difficult questions, I think, for society to gather around. But I think it's those kinds of things. Different ways of looking at taxation, different policies around housing, different ways of thinking about education and reskilling, different kind of careers where people work on very different things, and that self-employment becomes, and I don't mean working on a gig contract for somebody else. I mean genuinely working for yourself, and looking after each other are ideas that are going to come back to the fore. There's a new emerging theme around mutual aid, how we can support each other in different ways. And so all of these things, I think we're in the foothills of. I think these ideas will develop over the next decade. But hopefully that, Mike, gives you a bit more of a sort of sense of how we're thinking about things.
Norman, there's a question from Helen Turner that sort of goes to some of the stuff that you've just been talking about here. She says this: even with proper remuneration, many cannot afford a mortgage. She says she works in academia and colleagues under 40 haven't the resources, thus the inequality gap. Unless there is inheritance, how can we affect social mobility? So, property ownership has been one of the sort of engines of social mobility to some extent, hasn't it? Particularly in the last 20, 25 years. But other ideas?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do, and this is why we're engaging in discourse with as wide a cross-section of society as we can, is to realise the period that we've lived through. We look back on our parents and our grandparents' generations and the extraordinary times that they lived through, and we can see quite clearly the things that they did. One of the things we've lived through is an extraordinary boom in the value of property in this country. And there's a tendency to think that somehow we have been uniquely placed in history and have done something really special to accumulate so much wealth, when in fact it was a quirk of history and several decisions to stop building houses that have led to the ratchet in property prices in this country and indeed in other Western countries. So I think it's the kind of influence that we're looking to have is helping people to understand that unless these, and I completely agree, it is impossible at this point in time for people who are earning an average income to think about owning a house, that's only, it's storing up a problem for now, and it's storing up a bigger problem for later. And we need to grapple with that agenda really quickly. So I agree that unless we tackle these things, we are baking in great inequality in society, and social mobility and the notion of merit and meritocracy is an idea that will wither on the vine. And my concern is that with that, our whole idea of what a democracy is about is under threat. So, Helen, we're at the beginning of this work, but through it, we do have access to the higher echelons of government, and it's one of my views, quite wrongly actually, that governments rarely listen to ordinary people, but they do sometimes listen to business leaders. And if I can get more business leaders talking about this and the implications it's having for the people who work for them, the more likely it is whether this government or a future government will sit up and take notice of the size of the change that is required.
Today was obviously a Queen's speech. I don't know whether you've had time to sort of digest it in any detail. You've been busy doing this talk on at least one other occasion, as you've told us already. Is there anything that you've seen in it that has gladdened your heart? And whether there is or not, what are the other 3 things that you would love to have seen in that would affect the sorts of things directly that we've been discussing between us this evening?
I think there's one thing in the speech, which is one thing in the Queen's speech, which is the right idea, but unfortunately, I don't believe the execution will work. So the right idea is that people should be able to take out loans for ongoing education throughout their lives. And that should be something that goes with people wherever they start in life, and whether they go to university or not. It shouldn't be just for university students. I think that the idea that you should have some kind of pass for continually upskilling and learning is going to be an essential facet of the world for the next period I can envisage. I think where it falls short is the notion that is somehow going to be attractive if people are taking on more debt. So the fact that, I've talked about the levels of debt that already exist in society. Effectively it's a form of higher taxation. And you did ask me earlier on about other examples from around the world. The Dutch have a system where they have access to a support fund for education through your lifetime is paid for by the state. It's not paid for by individuals. And so I think it's the right idea, but the wrong execution, and therefore won't have the take up that it requires. I think there are another a number of other things that stand out to me in the work that we've done so far. One would be, this digital step change that the economy now needs to go through. There's lots of small individual initiatives going on around the place, but there isn't really the scale of re-equipping and reskilling going on that's required for young people and for people of all ages, indeed. And so I think perhaps this links to the earlier point, but we urgently need a different infrastructure in place in this country. I think they used to call them technical colleges, but in equipping young people with the digital skills that they're going to need for what's coming. So I think that's essential. And I think that the other thing that we've seen through the pandemic is the global world isn't quite as global as we thought it was. The dependence that we have on nations for the production of all kinds of things, whether it's face masks or vaccines, and the degree to which we are hugely dependent upon those supply chains being effective. I think if this pandemic shows us anything, it's just how vulnerable we are as a nation. And I would have liked to have thought that more thought would have gone into where this nation needs to generate a level of self-sufficiency in terms of its domestic either manufacturing or agricultural production or energy production that will ensure that Britain is as safe as houses for the future. And so I would have liked to have seen something about that.
One final question before we finish this evening, and we're going to send on an optimistic note. Before your tale of the young man and Orion, you talked about the fact that you were optimistic about the future because of the young people and their approach. What is it in the current generation that I'm educating, that your children are part of, that you see and gives you hope for the future and gives you a sense of, this isn't the bleak lost cause that it can appear to be when you start looking at the trends that you spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I think there are two or three things which I would share. First is, we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, even during COVID, young people, I would say, becoming outraged at some of the things the injustices that they see in society, and getting up off the sofa or from behind the laptop and saying, actually, this is wrong. And that sort of sense of passion and mobilization is a sure sign for me that change will come, and that this generation has rediscovered its voice in a way that perhaps my generation, which was so caught up with their careers, perhaps forgot about a little bit. So I'm quite encouraged by that kind of rediscovery of justice and a passion for that in this generation. I think the other thing is that the work that I do, there's another project I'm working on Black leadership, and the young people I have come across who because they found it difficult to make their way in corporate life, have gone out and set up incredible entrepreneurial activities, businesses, and who are doing things I frankly could not have imagined. And I think so that sort of entrepreneurial and creative flair, I think, is also hugely encouraging. And so I think if you put those two things together, a passion for justice, whether that's for climate or for inequality in society, and a passion and creativity to make things happen from an enterprise point of view. If we can combine those things, if we can create the conditions in which those things can thrive, then I think this next generation are going to teach us a few lessons.
I agree with you. I really do agree with you. to some extent, when you talked about the legacy that we are as a generation leaving behind to them, part of me thinks that at some point in the not too distant future, we need to get out of their way and to let them come through, because I think they've got a passion about making the world better that our generation hasn't necessarily shared to the same extent. So terrific. Norman, thank you so much for all you shared with us this evening. It's not a particularly enticing prospect for our children to look forward to, but it's great that we've ended on a note whereby we can see in them things that will be the foundation for them to tackle the things that we've left them. Good luck with the work that you're doing. I hope that you do get the ear of government, and that when you do more than whispering, you shout in it as loud as they'll let you do so, and that we'll begin to see our generation getting out of the way of the next one, and or the very least smoothing the path for them to take over in time. It's been great chatting to you. It's been lovely to hear your insights. It's an important piece of work, and we hope that it continues to go well for you. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much. Been great to be here, and good luck with this program of work. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we bid farewell to Norman, just to give you a heads up on our next Bootham talk, and that's going to be on the 15th of June. And we have another very intriguing and interesting guest, Jocelyn Bell Burnell, world famous physicist, Quaker, old scholar of the Mount School. We've managed to persuade her to come and talk to us about a life in science. So she's going to be talking about not just her life in science, but also opportunities for future scientists, who I guess are also going to be leading the way in their generation in making the world a better place. So do join us on the 15th of June for Jocelyn Bell Burnell talking on a life of science. Thank you again to Norman for this evening. Thank you to Elaine Phillips for setting this up, and a good evening to you all.